This week we're talking about data collection. Oh, that's part 3. Observational methods is what we're talking about today. Maybe. There we go. In social sciences, information is obtained in either formal or informal settings and using either verbal or nonverbal methods. These combinations create the 4 major methods of data collection. 4 major methods of data collection include observational methods, survey research, like using personal interviews and questionnaires, qualitative research, and the last is secondary data analysis, such as the analysis of existing documents. Triangulation is the use of multiple methods in a study to see if the findings that emerge from each will converge on a common conclusion, thereby increasing the validity of the results. An example would be a survey might be supplemented by an interview. If the findings obtained by different data are consistent, the validity of the findings are increased. Each of the 4 major methods of data collection has certain advantages as well as limitations. To a certain degree, all research findings are affected by the nature of the data collection methods and assumptions used. Artifacts are findings that are strongly affected by methods and assumptions rather than the empirical facts. An example in the 1950s with the birth of TV research showed that observing violence could cause violent behavior. While it may be true in the 1950s and 60s, this concept may be an artifact today. Research in the social sciences is rooted in empirical observation. Examples: political scientists observe the behavior of occupants of political offices. Anthropologists observe rituals in simple rural as well as complex urban societies. Social psychologists observe interactions in small groups. In a sense, all social science research begins and ends with empirical observation. Modern social science is rooted in observation, and this technique of studying behavior has a number of distinguishing characteristics and/or advantages. It is direct, it takes place in natural settings, it allows the study of people who cannot or will not report their own behavior, it invites comparison of verbal reports and actual behavior, it facilitates analysis of the context in which behavior occurs. The main advantage of observation is directness. This enables researchers to study behavior in real time as it occurs. A researcher does not have to ask people about their own behavior and the actions of others. He or she can simply watch them act and speak. This enables the researcher to collect data firsthand, thereby preventing contamination or distortion of the data by factors or events standing between him or her and the object of research. An example: when people are asked to report their past behavior, distortions in memory may influence the findings significantly, whereas the memory has no effect on the behavioral data collected through observational methods. Observation describes phenomena as they occur in their natural settings. Observation demands a lower level of activity, of active involvement from those being studied compared to verbal reports, which includes children who tend to find it difficult to be introspective, qualifying day-to-day encounters as more than just good or bad, observing individuals who are unwilling to express themselves verbally. Christmas. Through observation, researchers can validate verbal reports by comparing them with actual behavior. Finally, because the relationship between an individual and their environment is not altered in studies using observation, the researcher can detect the impact the environment has on the persons being studied. This facilitates analysis of contextual background of behavior observed. Okay. Why did I put this in here? Because I didn't have anything. I needed a picture, I guess. Observation is a suitable method for a variety of research purposes. and exploratory research in order to gain insights that will subsequently be tested as hypotheses. When collecting supplementary data for interpreting or validating findings obtained by other methods as primary methods of data collection in descriptive studies. Researchers must answer four major questions to ensure that the data obtained are systematic and meaningful. What will be observed? Where and when will the observations take place? How will the data be recorded? And how much interference is required? Now, as you are thinking about your own research, these are four questions you need to ask yourself. Now, you're not going to actually do the research that you're creating the proposal for. Well, probably not, potentially not. But what I want you to do is understand how the process works. If you understand how the process works, when you get to your final project, when you take 411 or when you take 498, Psych 411 or Psych 498, you will understand how the process works. So you'll know what you'll have to do. You need to ask yourself what will be observed. If you're talking about depression, are you going to observe anything? Well, potentially what you're going to be doing is giving people surveys. Where and when will the observations take place? In this case, you could send the surveys by mail and ask them to send them back. You'd have to put a stamped, addressed envelope in with your survey, but that's okay. That's where and when they're going to take place. How will the data be recorded? You'll be recording, maybe you will be looking at certain questions and recording the answers to those certain questions. Potentially, you'll create a depression scale, or you'll use a depression scale, and you'll get that information from the scale itself. How much inference is required? In other words, you're giving somebody a depression scale, and are you going to infer that if they get a really high score on this, that they are clinically depressed? The answer may be no. They just maybe have mild to moderate depression because of the answers. Observation requires operational definitions. The operational definitions will determine how the variables will be measured based on nonverbal behavior, spatial behavior, linguistic behavior, and extralinguistic behavior. This has to do with interviews, of course. You need to define everything, and of course this is something that I've talked about when I've talked about your research, is that I need to know what this means. One example had to do with potholes in Chin-Lee. The question is, how do we define potholes? Are they a certain depth? Are they a certain width? Are they any break in the pavement? How in the world are we defining potholes? Nonverbal behavior defined as the body movements of the organism and consists of motor expressions that may originate in various parts of the body. Nonverbal behaviors have been proven to be valid indicators of social, political, and psychological processes experienced by individuals and groups. Facial expressions in particular convey a whole range of emotions, including fear, surprise, anger, disgust, and sadness. Spatial behavior refers to the actions taken by individuals as they structure the physical space around them. For example, people can move toward or away from a person or object. They can maintain closeness or distance in various contexts. Violations of personal space frequently produce stress, a condition in which people report feeling tense and anxious. The outcomes of stress lead to physiological symptoms, changes in galvanic skin response, pulse rate, blood pressure, and so forth. Good example. Well, I think we're going to talk about body. What am I thinking? We're going to talk about physical space, personal space, personal space. We're going to talk about personal space. Scientists can use behavior as indicators of culturally determined spatial norms in a number of physical settings, such as crowds. Researchers must be acutely aware of cultural differences when it comes to spatial behavior. There are distinct patterns in the way that people use the space immediately surrounding them when they interact with others. Cultural variations in personal space can have significant implications for behavior in culturally diverse cities and societies. Um, Let me give you a little example. I'm from Indiana. My ancestors come from England. They come from Western Europe, and they come from Ireland. All of those countries, and Germany. Well, that's Western Europe. Anyway, all those countries have fairly large personal spaces. So I'm not used to getting close to people. In Indiana, it's kind of a dance that you do. The closer you get to somebody, the farther away they move from you. Um, the we used to have an instructor at Dene College named Sarah Kine. Dr. Kine is from Canada. Originally, she's from Canada, and Canadians, of course, are English. And her, I'm not sure what her maiden name was, but Kine is her married name. But she's Canadian. I'm from Indiana, and it was really kind of interesting to watch us. Uh, and the first person that noticed this was Marius Begay. Marius said, "It's really interesting to watch you and Sarah because the closer you get to her, the farther away she backs. And the closer she gets to you, the farther away you back. It's like a little dance. We had to maintain at least, it was like 6 feet. It would have been good for the coronavirus, but she wasn't here when the coronavirus hit. So it was really kind of interesting that we had so much personal space between the two of us. We both required so much personal space. Now the interesting thing was that she didn't require that personal space with everyone. Other females could get closer to her, but for males it was fairly large, and for me the same way. But then again, I've traveled all over the world, and I've been in a lot of different cultures. In Japan, I'll tell you what, if you try to stay far away from everybody, eventually, well, you can't. Because when you are on a public conveyance, you're right on top of each other, literally almost. South Americans have narrower personal spaces than do North Americans, Germans, and the English. Individuals from German and Argentinian backgrounds may find it more difficult to interact with one another because each has difficulty establishing a satisfactory interpersonal space with the other. As curious as this is. Now, this is an interesting picture because she's the one from Argentina and he's the one from Germany. So they have switched. They've switched outfits. I'm guessing they're dating each other or something. Linguistic behavior refers to words, the manifest content of speech, and the various attributes of verbal communication. Extensive use of measures of linguistic behavior has been made particularly in studies on social interaction. Extralinguistic behavior or paralanguage, words in themselves make up only a small portion of the linguistic content of behavior. The non-content aspects of verbal behavior, such as the rate of speaking, loudness, and the tendency to interrupt, and pronunciation peculiarities, constitute a fruitful source of data. The concept of body language refers to essentially the same phenomena. Interesting thing about people from Indiana, there are certain words that we constantly mispronounce. One of them is the word color, C-O-L-O-R. We say it the same way as we say color. The extra piece of clothing, a cloth that goes around your neck, that's your collar. And we say them both the same way. Another one is that people from Indiana, a lot of times they will put an R in Washington, Washington, Washington. They say Washington. So if you're going to wash your car, you don't say I'm going to wash my car. You say you're going to wash your car, and that's fairly common there. So that's a speech pattern. People from Indiana. One of the things I notice is that a lot of people from the East Coast talk so fast, or people from California talk so fast. Um, this I find fairly irritating. They'll call me on the phone trying to sell me something, and I won't understand what they're saying because they're speaking too fast. And you may see the same thing. The average duration of spontaneous speech increases the size of the group as the group increases. So the more people you're talking to, the faster you tend to speak. The frequency with which one person interrupts another reflects differences in personal power. The person doing the interrupting is the person in power. And if you interrupt something with more power than you, then they get irritated. And of course, this was continually happening with President Trump. If somebody tried to ask a question and it interrupted him, he got angry. People express passive emotions such as sadness through slow, muted, and lower pitched speech. They communicate active emotions such as anger by fast, loud, and high pitched speech. Another set of issues influencing when to use observational methods concerns the timing and recording of the observations. Time sampling is the process of selecting observation units, specific points in time at which to make observations. Time sampling ensures the representativeness of the ongoing activities observed, otherwise known as the defined population of behavior. Individual sampling or specimen records and individual sampling. In individual sampling, the researcher selects one individual and records all the behavior and events experienced by that individual during a specified period of time. For example, when studying classroom aggression, the researcher might choose one child and record all instances of physical aggression between that child and other classmates for a period of 30 minutes. Every 30 minutes, a different child would be selected and observed. All the observations collected, the total data set would then represent the behavior of the entire class. A coding system is required for recording the observations. Researchers must categorize and assign a code for each category. A coding system can be constructed by applying either a deductive approach or an inductive approach. A deductive approach, the researcher begins with a conceptual definition, specifies indicators of the behavior to be observed, then standardizes and validates the resulting instrument. The observer assigns the observations to predefined categories at the time the observation is recorded. Inductive approach requires the researcher to select indicators at the first stage of data collection and to postpone the construction of conceptual definitions until a pattern is identified. Each approach involves some risk. When using the deductive approach, it is difficult to foresee whether the conceptual definition is sufficiently precise. The inductive approach poses difficulties in interpreting the observation. When the ideal way to reduce these risks is to combine the two approaches. Categories to which observations are assigned must exhibit certain characteristics. They must be explicit, they must be exhaustive, and they must be mutually exclusive. Degree of interference. Most observational data collection methods involve some degree of inference. Degree of inference. When observing a certain act or behavior, the researcher must infer whether the behavior indicates the variable being investigated. Some observations demand a low degree of inference from the observer. Many acts, however, require a greater degree of inference. The reliability of the inference depends to a large extent on the competence of the observer. Um, and this is one of the things this is one of the reasons why when you define what you're talking about, you need to define it in specific concrete terms. Let's say we're doing that observation, watching aggression on the playground in elementary school. So what is aggression? So for boys, it may be hitting, it may be yelling at, and maybe getting in people's faces. That may be considered aggression. But is it the same for little girls? Little girls don't do that much hitting. They don't really get in each other's faces. Sometimes it has their form of aggression has to do with saying really mean things to each other. So you need to make these definitions before it takes place. You need to infer, and how do you determine uh, if somebody is being aggressive? If it doesn't always look like aggression. Let me say that. Two general types of observational methods, controlled and non-controlled. The two are differentiated by extent to which decisions regarding behavior, timing, recording, and inference are systematically and rigorously implemented. Controlled observation methods characterized by clear and explicit decisions made as to what, how, and when to observe. Non-controlled observation considerably less systematic and allows for greater flexibility. And this is supposed to be, this is her being flexible. This is the same lady. This is her being flexible. Controlled observation can be carried out in the laboratory as well as in the field. In both settings, scientists wish to maximize control over extrinsic and intrinsic variables as a means to support the inference of causality. Another huge study found no evidence that cell phones cause cancer. What is the WHO thinking? World Health Organization. I think they just got it backward. Huh? We'll take a look. The United States total cancer incidence cell phone users. There are so many problems with that. Just to be safe, until I see more data, I'm going to assume cancer causes cell phones. There you go, cancer causes cell phones. The most highly controlled method of data collection used in the social sciences is laboratory experimentation. Laboratory experimentation involves the creation of a controlled environment in the laboratory where the situation's elements can be adjusted by the researcher according to a set plan. Laboratory experimentation permits simulation of certain features of a natural environment along with the manipulation of one or more elements, the independent variables, in order to observe the effects produced. Experimental realism is an experiment that is realistic if the situation is experienced as real by the research participants. Mundane realism is the extent to which events taking place in the laboratory setting are likely to occur outside it in the real world. An experiment high on mundane realism and low on experimental realism does not necessarily yield more meaningful results than one that is high on experimental realism and low on mundane realism. Laboratory experiments, three potential types of bias. Bias due to the demand characteristics of the experimental situation itself. Bias due to the unintentional influence of experimenters and measurement artifacts. Bias due to demand characteristics may occur when individuals who know that they are in an experimental situation and who are aware that they are being observed believe that certain responses are expected of them. responses to the experimental manipulation may reflect the participants' interpretations of the behavior the manipulations are intended to elicit. A commonly used term for this sort of bias is desirability bias. Bias due to the behavior of the experimenter, the experimental expectancy effect. Researchers may unintentionally communicate their expectations regarding the participants' behavior in various ways, showing tension or relief, nodding when certain responses are made. Bias in measurement. Measurement procedures may introduce bias into the data by giving hints about the true purpose of the experiment. Those hints may operate in a manner similar to the experimenter bias or demand characteristics. Measuring instruments may be reactive in that they may alter the phenomenon being measured. Timing of measurement may also lead to misleading results. A field experiment is research which takes place in a natural environment. In a field experiment, the investigator manipulates one or more independent variables under conditions that are as carefully controlled as the situation permits. The difficulties involved in controlling intrinsic and especially extrinsic factors are considerably greater in field experiments. The strength of field experiments, they permit investigation of complex interactions, processes, and the change in real-life natural situations. The weaknesses, it lies in the area of control. Researchers cannot control intrinsic and extrinsic sources of validity as systematically in field experiments as they can in laboratory experiments. Ethical issues are also a concern. Pilot studies are test runs or pre-tests of the experiment that enable the investigator to ascertain whether the research participants or any other aspect of the research design are likely to differ systematically on any relevant factor other than their responses to the independent variable. Ethics in field experiments. The participants in field experiments are often unaware that they are taking part in research. The social scientist has to ensure that the privacy of the affected individuals is not violated and that they are protected from undue embarrassment or distress. For some reason, these people were told to take off their clothes and show everybody their underwear. I can't remember what this is all about, but it happened up in Canada. Natural experiment is exactly as it sounds, an experiment carried out in an environment that has not been manipulated by the experimenter. Relative to laboratory experimentation and field experiments, the key difference is that the manipulation of the environment is naturally occurring. And that is the end of the chapter. So there you go.